Have you ever wondered how a country is actually made? Well, today we're diving into one of the biggest stories out there, the history of the United States. We're going to take a journey from a few scattered colonies on the edge of a continent all the way to a global superpower. Let's get right into it. And that really is the central question, isn't it? The question that's going to guide us through this whole explainer. How did that happen? How do you go from a handful of settlements to one of the most powerful and influential nations in history? That's the story we're here to unpack.
So, to really understand this story, we've got to rewind. Way, way back. Long before there was a United States. Our story really begins with a collision of two worlds, the people who first called this land home and the Europeans who arrived much, much later.
Now take a look at this timeline. It really puts things into perspective. For something like 15,000 years, this continent was home to hundreds of Native American tribes, each with their own complex cultures and societies. Then, in what is just a blink of an eye, historically speaking, you see these other events, a brief Viking visit, then Columbus in 1492, which really changed everything, and finally, the English setting up their first permanent towns in the 1600s. It's just a powerful reminder of how deep the history of this land really is. And those English settlements grew into what we know as the 13 colonies. But they weren't all the same, not by a long shot. They basically developed into three very distinct regions. Up in New England, you had these really tight-knit religious communities making a living from small farms in the sea. Then you had the middle colonies, which were super diverse, way more tolerant, and known as the breadbasket for all the grain they grew. And then you had the South. Its entire economy was built on huge plantations growing cash crops, an economy that was tragically dependent on the brutal system of slavery. So you've got these different colonies, all ruled by Great Britain from thousands of miles away. But over time, they started to develop their own identity and a shared feeling of being fed up. This is what sets the stage for the dramatic and frankly unlikely birth of a brand new country. And if you want to boil all that frustration down to just 4 words, this is it. No taxation without representation. It was a killer slogan. The colonists were furious that a government an ocean away was imposing taxes on them, but they had absolutely no voice, no vote, no say in that government. So this was never just about money. It was about a core demand for fairness and the right to govern themselves. And that demand, it escalated fast. It started with protests like the famous Boston Tea Party, where they dumped a bunch of tea into the harbor. But soon, protests turned into battles, and a full-blown war for independence was on, with George Washington leading the Continental Army. Right in the thick of it all, they dropped a bombshell on the world, the Declaration of Independence. And here's the crazy part. Against all odds, with some absolutely critical help from France, they actually won. So you've won the war. Now what? The new United States had to create a government from scratch. The result was the Constitution, basically the rule book for how this new country would work. And, of course, they elected their wartime hero, George Washington, to be the first president. But, and this is a huge but, it's so important to remember that those soaring ideals of freedom and equality didn't apply to everyone. Women, Native Americans, and of course, millions of enslaved people were completely left out of the promise. So this young country begins to grow, pushing its borders westward at an incredible speed. But as the nation got bigger, a deep, dark crack running right down the middle of it got bigger and bigger too. The engine driving all this expansion was this idea called manifest destiny. It was this powerful, almost religious belief that the United States had a God-given right to stretch from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. Now, this idea fueled an incredible wave of settlement, but it came at an absolutely devastating cost to the Native American tribes who were brutally forced off their ancestral lands. And this chart right here, it lays out that massive crack in the country perfectly. You essentially had 2 different nations developing under one flag. The North was building an economy based on factories and industry. The South, on the other hand, was completely dependent on an agricultural economy powered by the labor of enslaved people. These weren't just economic differences. We're talking about 2 completely different societies with fundamentally opposing views on human morality. But even in the face of this horrific injustice, there were incredible heroes who fought back. Think about the courage of someone like Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery herself and then went back again and again to lead others to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Or Frederick Douglass, whose powerful speeches and writings exposed the lie of American freedom. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which opened the eyes of millions to the sheer cruelty of the system. In the end, the division was just too deep to fix with words. The conflict exploded into the Civil War, the deadliest war in American history.
The victory for the North preserved the country and officially ended slavery, but it left behind unbelievable devastation and began the very long, very painful task of trying to rebuild a single nation.
Okay, so the nation is stitched back together, but the scars are still there. Now, the story pivots. The late 1800s and early 1900s are when the United States transforms big time. It goes from a country of farms to an industrial powerhouse, and, for the first time, a major player on the world stage.
And this change was just explosive. You've got these mind-blowing new inventions like electricity and the telephone that are changing everyday life. Railroads are crisscrossing the country, connecting everything. This leads to cities just booming as millions of people leave farms to find work in factories. And what's fueling all this growth? People. Millions of immigrants from all over the world pouring in, chasing the promise of the American dream.
And all of that new economic muscle, well, it started to flex on the world stage. After getting involved in conflicts like the Spanish-American War and then playing a decisive role in winning World War I, there was no denying it anymore. The United States was officially a global power. You know, the 20th century was just a complete roller coaster. You had the incredible boom and cultural excitement of the Roaring '20s, which then came to a screeching halt with the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression, a decade of unbelievable hardship. But the country pulled through, partly thanks to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs. And that resilience was tested like never before when the U.S. was pulled into World War II. Its role in that victory is what truly cemented its status as the world's leading superpower. So, America comes out of World War II on top of the world. But this next chapter is all about a new kind of global conflict, and, just as importantly, a renewed and powerful fight for justice and equality right at home. After the war, the world basically split in two. It was a whole new kind of rivalry, the Cold War. On one side, you had the United States and its democratic allies. On the other, the communist Soviet Union. It wasn't a direct war, but it was this tense, decades-long global chess match fought with propaganda, a race to space, and terrifyingly close calls with nuclear weapons, like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So while America was championing freedom around the globe during the Cold War, it had to confront the hypocrisy within its own borders. The civil rights movement rose up to demand that the country live up to its own ideals. Through landmark court victories, through the sheer bravery of people like Rosa Parks, and the inspiring leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the movement fought to tear down segregation and secure basic human rights for all African Americans.
So when you put it all together, what does American influence look like today? Well, this chart gives us a pretty good idea. It's really a mix of things. You've got the world's largest economy, a military that's second to none, a massive cultural footprint, think movies, music, tech, and of course, the power of innovation that comes from its incredible diversity.
But let's be real, the story doesn't have a perfect fairy tale ending. Far from it. The country is still wrestling with a long legacy of racism, with a widening gap between the rich and poor, and with political divisions that feel deeper than ever. These are the great challenges of our time.
And that brings us to the present. You know, when you look back, the story of the USA is this incredible, complicated mix of soaring ideals and deep contradictions, of amazing progress and painful struggles. It's a story of constant reinvention and remarkable resilience, which really just leaves us with one final big question to think about. What will the next chapter be?